Joining us now on the line from New York, New York to talk backyard poultry. There's Susan Orlean, writer for The New Yorker. And Susan, we're glad you could spare some time for us tonight. How are you doing?
I'm great. Happy to be with you.
Very good. Well, you wrote a piece in The New Yorker last month that outlines your experience not as a farmer raising chickens, but rather as a writer raising chickens. And you remind us in that piece that chickens were such a fixture in most households that even as Americans drifted from the country to the cities, they took their chickens with them. And if that was the case, why did keeping urban chickens all but disappear from North America these days?
It was for a number of reasons. When there was a great shift in the population centers going from farms to cities, people tended to bring something that's still connected to that agrarian past. As the idea of being modern took hold, people wanted to move away from that. There was a great attraction with feeling modern and shopping in supermarkets and buying things that were very urban and disconnecting from that past and actually viewing a connection to a rural past as being old-fashioned. So that was the first problem that that the backyard chicken had to face, which was suddenly they were in association with the past that people were eager to leave behind. Coupled with that, the fact that towns and cities did begin enacting ordinances that kept animals, livestock, from being kept in yards. Then in addition, eggs became a bit suspect. I mean, people were keeping chickens for their eggs. In the 60s, when cholesterol became the bad guy in the diet, the attraction for having eggs and having fresh eggs started to fall away. So all these things converged, and suddenly keeping a backyard chicken was really an oddity.
And yet, all of that notwithstanding, you tell us some people are keeping chickens again. To what do you account the kind of increase in popularity in doing that these days?
Well, just as a convergence of facts pushed chickens out of the backyard, a new convergence of facts has brought them back into the backyard. I think primary among them is an interest in local food, organic food, raising your own food, a sense of self-sufficiency that I think has become more and more popular, a desire to have a connection to where your food comes from. I also think what's very important in this is a sort of rehabilitation of the image of the chicken. And chickens were always poor people's livestock. They were cheap to buy. There was nothing glamorous about them. As the move towards urban living became popular, the idea of a connection to poor people's livestock was very unattractive. When you have someone like Martha Stewart, who began promoting chicken keeping as much as 20 years ago, starting to present chickens as these interesting, funny, and beautiful animals that could also be useful, people started changing their opinion about it. Then it became almost an extension of the interest in gardening and doing things by hand that has been underway probably for the last 10 or 15 years in a very powerful way, doing things yourself, doing things by hand.
Well, let's get a sense about how widespread this, if it is in fact a burgeoning trend, is happening. Okay, we get that people in rural America, perhaps rural Canada, are doing this, maybe even in the exurbs. Do you see this kind of thing happening in the suburbs, in downtown Manhattan? Where's it happening?
It's happening really, it's very widespread. It's happening across this country. I'm sure it's certainly happening in Canada, in Britain. There is a movement towards keeping a small flock, and I mean as few as 2 or 3 or 4 chickens, in places that you normally wouldn't think about having chickens. There have been movements to revise city ordinances to permit chicken keeping in a lot of cities, including Denver, Portland, Maine, Cleveland. It's happening really all over the country. Ann Arbor, Michigan, where a movement, enough people are saying, look, I want to be able to keep a couple of chickens. I'm going to keep it clean. I won't have a rooster. It won't be noisy. Why shouldn't I be able to keep a few chickens? It is widespread. I don't think you're going to find suddenly everyone in Manhattan keeping a chicken in their Upper East Side co-op, but I think you will see more and more people doing it where they have appropriate space. The big chicken hatcheries that sell to hobby farmers are selling out entirely. Murray McMurray, which is the biggest hatchery in the United States that sells just to individuals, has sold out entirely of their chickens for the last few years. And we're talking about 2 million chickens that are being sold, and the average order is small. The average order is 3 or 4 or 5 chickens. So it's not 10 or 20 people buying thousands of chickens. It's actually a lot of people around the country buying just a few chickens.
And in fact, you were one of them. And let's talk a bit about that, because it's one thing to write about a phenomenon, you know, as an outsider looking in, but I guess you decided to take a step beyond that. How come?
You know, I had seen a documentary called The Natural History of the Chicken a few years ago, and I had never thought about keeping chickens. This presented them as interesting, funny, social, something that you'd enjoy watching, enjoy having around, and it kind of got in my head. I thought, well, I want chickens. I like animals. I love animals, actually. I have a dog. I have 2 cats. I had never thought about getting chickens, but once I thought, wow, I could then get eggs, and they looked easy to take care of, and they are. They're very easy. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I want chickens, and I've lived in Manhattan for many years. I now live outside of Manhattan. I have plenty of space to keep them, but it still hadn't occurred to me till I saw chickens as something that could be fun, easy, and the payoff, of course, being that you get eggs.
And once you decide that you want to be a person who keeps chickens, how do you actually go about buying chickens, setting up a place for them, all of that stuff?
Well, believe it or not, as a reporter, I'm usually pretty good at figuring things out, but it took me a while to figure out where do you get chickens. I didn't want to get little tiny chicks. They're very delicate. You need to buy a large number of them. You have to keep them in under a heat lamp. I thought, I don't want to do that. I just want a nice couple of hens who are going to be able to take care of themselves and start laying eggs soon. I didn't know where you got them. This was a whole new world for me. I had no idea. I probably had never Googled the word chicken in my life before I started thinking about where do you get chickens. Well, where do you get chickens? You get them pretty much anywhere. In this case, when I finally found this very attractive modern chicken house called an igloo that was first manufactured in England and is now available in the U.S., you can order the igloo with chickens. So for a first-time chicken farmer and someone who is not primarily a farmer, this was a dream come true. I went online, I ordered a chicken house with chickens. It was kind of painless. And they arrived. First came the chicken house, which was delivered by UPS. Then a few days later, I got a call from my post office, and the clerk said, you have a package here, and it's clucking. I went into town and picked up my box, and it had 4 chickens in it. It was actually very thrilling and also astonishing that you could get chickens mail order.
You can get anything
almost like
mail
getting
order
a mail
these days.
order bride. So then suddenly there I was. I was a hobby chicken farmer, and it was really, you know, since then I've learned so much about it. There are people buying and selling and trading chickens all over the place. Once you break the code, once you find those chicken groups online, for instance, backyardchickens.com has something like 18,000 members. So there are so many people doing it, and they're getting together as groups to help each other trade information, trade chickens. All the chickens I've gotten since then, I've gotten through other chicken owners who either had too many or were, had chicks and were selling off some of them. So I now feel that I'm part of the whole chicken underworld.
Okay, in which case this is an extremely inappropriate question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because that's basically what I do for a living. I know you like the eggs. Do you ever plan to eat these chickens?
Well, it's a good question. Chickens live longer than the part of their life where they're laying eggs. So at some point, my chickens will no longer be productive as egg layers. I eat chicken. I eat chicken all the time. I had chicken last night, as a matter of fact.
But not your chickens.
Not my chickens.
And that's different.
I think a lot of people who raise chickens do eat them. I asked Martha Stewart this question. She slaughters her older chickens and eats them. And, if you think about it and you've given them a great life, my chickens live a very nice life. So if they were to end up being eaten, it would be not a cruel thing to do. And I'm not a vegetarian. But I haven't made that leap, nor have I had to face that issue because my oldest chicken is still laying eggs.
Susan, I see the guilt screaming out of the camera right at me. Let's face it,
know,
you're having a tough time with this, aren't you?
It's funny because I don't have a moral issue with it. I think, of course, I eat meat, but they're so much my pets, and I only have 7, so I know them all very well. On the other hand, if they all age out of their egg laying, and I'm basically just keeping them as pets, you have to wonder, well, is that practical? Does it make sense to keep old chickens as pets?
If they're pets, they must have names.
And particularly if I would get younger ones who would continue laying eggs, I can see where it becomes a problem, and I wouldn't want to butcher chicken myself, but I also feel like there's not a logical thing to do with them if they're not laying eggs anymore. So I'll have to see.
You're not there yet, I can tell. But if
the jury is still out.
Jury's out. If they're pets, I'm going to assume they've got names. You
They
want to
all
tell
have
us what their names are?
Yes, and actually it's one of the fun things about having chickens is naming them. They are Tukey, Mabel Black Label, Ruby, Merry-Go-Round, Tina Louise, Tweed, and I have a rooster named Laura, and he was named Laura when we thought he was a hen, and he turned out to be a rooster, but we still call him Laura. And I should say my 4-year-old has been the source of many of these names.
Yeah, Tina Louise, though, was on Gilligan's Island, and your 4-year-old can't possibly remember that show, so that's got to be yours.
Mine.
That's got to be yours.
That was mine. And Mabel Black Label, I'm also happy to say my son at 4 does not yet drink beer, and that's from a
okay.
Let me read you. Commercial.
Let me read you. Oh, we know that up here for sure. Let me read you an excerpt from an editorial earlier this summer in our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, which says, in jurisdictions where urban chickens are permitted, there is an increase in complaints about smells and flies, though advocates provide assurances that these can be addressed by properly cleaning chicken coops and properly composting manure. There are also concerns over an increase in disease, notably avian flu, although we are again assured if coops are properly built and maintained to make sure chickens are protected from fecal matter dropped by birds flying overhead, disease need not be a problem. I mean, this touches on a lot of things that I suspect people are pretty concerned about, particularly in this day and age when we hear a lot about H1N1 and all of the different diseases that are flying around and making us concerned. Do we have to revisit this issue about whether or not chickens ought to be legal in heavily urban areas?
Well, certainly, and I think it would be unrealistic to simply say we shouldn't worry about this, there are no concerns whatsoever. It is an issue to bear in mind. Smell and flies, that's a matter of cleanliness. If you kept 4 or 5 dogs in your backyard and you didn't clean it, you'd have smell and flies. So that's just a fact of public health and having enforcement of code violations if people aren't keeping things clean. The issue of avian flu, it's something that I can't pretend to be an expert. However, if your chickens are not traveling around and they're not interacting with the wild bird population, and obviously there's some way that you can't entirely control that, but the concern about avian flu, if I'm not mistaken, was more animals, birds rather, that are moving from one place to another and spreading flu. I don't think a small backyard flock that stays in your backyard, that doesn't travel around, is going to increase the spread of any sort of flu because they're not traveling anywhere. Mm-hmm. I did a story a few years ago about racing pigeons, and it's a bigger issue with racing pigeons because they travel from one place to another, and there's more of a concern about viruses being moved from one place to another and subsequently spreading. I'm not pretending to be an expert on this. I don't know if that's the case, but I really don't think the small flock is going to be an issue when it comes to something like spreading flu.
Okay.
The concerns about noise, if you don't have a rooster, you're probably not going to bother a neighbor. Keeping chicken coop clean, you should do it anyway if you're a good caretaker of your animals, but cities need to be able to enforce that.
Sure. Susan, I got about a half a minute left here, and I
Sure.
want to ask you about this because I've seen a lot of wacky titles in my day, but this is a different one. What is a professional chicken sexer?
Don't you just love saying that?
It's a good title.
It's just yeah. It's really hard to tell the difference between a girl and a boy chicken for a long time. In fact, the case of my rooster Laura is a perfect example of this. It's really difficult to tell. In the commercial poultry industry, it's a very important thing. They don't want to spend time and money raising what they think is going to be a hen to discover 20 or 30 weeks into the process that it's a rooster. So people are trained to be able to tell. A layperson can't do it, but people who are trained in sexing chickens is going to have a higher likelihood of being able to figure it out, and you wouldn't end up with something like Laura, the rooster, if a professional had sexed the chicken.
You know, most answers I get I want to follow up on and hear more about, but actually I think this is an exception to the rule. I'm going to leave it there. I am. Susan Orlean from the New Yorker magazine, it's good of you to join us on the line from the Big Apple. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
You too.